Compassion is the quivering heart's response to suffering. Or as Jack Kornfield put it, compassion is a verb. It's an activity, it's an action. It's not just a feeling or a state, it's something that we do. Where empathy is being able to feel or understand another person's experience, to put ourselves in their shoes, compassion goes further by responding to suffering in a particular way, with wisdom and with courage. There's a useful distinction that I learned from a Zen teacher named Diane Musho Hamilton, and I'd like to share that with you. And it explores these different faces of compassion, these different aspects or facets of how compassion can manifest or not. Very simply, we could look on the one hand at two different forms of compassion, masculine compassion and feminine compassion. And then each of these two forms can take either a diluted or an awakened perspective, can take a diluted or awakened form. So masculine compassion and feminine, in either its diluted or awakened forms. And it's important here to, especially because we live in a pluralistic society, to recognize that these distinctions of masculine and feminine, they don't directly correlate with either one's biological sex, the gender that one was born with, or with one's standard gender identity, the sense of gender that we may identify with. Rather, they're more of an energetic expression taking on a gendered form in any particular moment. They're shaped by biology, they're shaped by culture, they're shaped by our personal identity, but they're not determined by any of those things. We all have the capacity to experience these different facets or faces of compassion. And deep compassion, true compassion, this profoundly awakened compassion is actually fluid and formless. It goes beyond these distinctions. It takes on whatever form is needed to respond to suffering. So let's start with the diluted forms of compassion. And by diluted, I simply mean that we think that we're doing the right thing, but in fact we're missing something. We're deluded, we're ignoring, ignorant of, confused about some aspect of reality. Delusion is when there's a lack of wisdom and discrimination present. So the deluded masculine form of compassion, that is the deluded masculine expression of trying to help, kind of looks like this. First, in terms of one's sense of self, of sense of identity, it is rigid and fixed. It's rigid and fixed around my needs, my comforts, my ideals, the way that I think things should be. And as a result, the deluded masculine is the righteous know-it-all. I think we've all seen examples, and many of us have been this person who is mansplaining something to another person. And I actually don't think it's just men who can mansplain. I think anyone can get in this way of being where they think they really know everything and they're going to tell everyone the way it is. This is the deluded masculine. In action, the deluded masculine lashes out in a violent way. Sometimes it's small violent way, like being critical. Sometimes it's in a large violent way, like actually really coming to physical harm. This attempt to solve the problem by destroying the cause is what in a way makes it compassion. There is an attempt to solve a problem, but it's clearly deluded in thinking, one, that it understands the cause, and that it's as simple as just destroying it or getting rid of it or smashing it down to size. And so the form that this often takes is, one, it can take the form of self-violence. We're actually being violent to ourselves. This can even go as far as, say, committing suicide. It can also take the form of violence toward others. In this case, if you take it to the extreme, it'd be like genocide, where we think if we just could destroy those people, get them out of the way, then everything would be okay. In the context of meditation practice, the diluted masculine is present any time that there's a battle going on with some aspect of our experience. One of my favorite examples of this is in seeing what happens when we return back to whatever practice we're doing from when the mind wanders. Oftentimes people report that when their mind wanders and they notice it, before they can return, there's a little bit of a battle that happens. There's a little bit of a self-flagellation of, oh, why did I lose the breath again? Or why did I lose the object? Or why did I forget what I was doing? And there's a sense of kind of wanting to whip one into shape. You know, if I just kind of beat myself up a little bit here, if I just kind of give myself a little whack, then I'll do better next time. But in fact, that actually makes it harder to meditate because we start to create an internal conflict, an internal battle. Makes it harder to relax and to forgive ourselves when we naturally wander. That's one of the ways it takes form in terms of self-violence in meditation. It can also show up in a group setting if you're practicing with other people. I remember when I was on a long retreat at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, I was about a month into the retreat, and I was going through a really difficult phase of practice. Everything became challenging. I became irritable. There was a lot of unpleasant experience going on. And what did I do? Well, first I started to blame it on different things in my environment, and I started to look for the cause and try to eliminate it. And one of the main causes that I could find, the only thing I could really see had changed, because prior to that my practice had been great, was that a new group of folks had entered in the second month of the retreat. And one of them sat right near me, and he was breathing really loud. I nicknamed this guy in my mind the loud breathing hippie dude. And I could just, every time I sat, I could just hear him breathing. The whole sit was filled with his breathing, his loud breathing, and my reaction to it. And so at a certain point, I just was so determined that this was the problem. At some level, I thought this, that I decided to move across the hall and sit on the other side of the hall. And this is after a month of being, in the seat. I mean, it's so ridiculous in a way. And yet, that's kind of how I was seeing it. I thought he was the problem, and if I just kind of passively, aggressively, because I couldn't, I wasn't going to talk to him. It's a silent retreat, but I got away and kind of blamed him. And then naturally, as my practice relaxed and opened, then suddenly it wasn't so much of a problem. And I wondered, why did I move across the hall to get away from this guy who was really just breathing? I don't know. Everyone else around him didn't move. So what was that? Now let's talk a little bit about diluted feminine compassion. And here we can look at the feminine sense of self and the diluted feminine sense of self as being primarily organized around others' needs, comforts, and ideas. In a sense, it's like we're giving ourselves over to the others. Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron writes about this on what she calls, and what her teacher called, idiot compassion. She said it's the general tendency to give people what they want because you can't bear to see them suffering. And why is it that one wouldn't be able to bear seeing another person suffering? Well, it could be that their suffering bothers us. That might be the diluted masculine, or it could be that we're so identified with that other person that we can't bear to see them suffering. And this is the diluted feminine. In action, the diluted feminine tends to enable delusions in others and dysfunctional behavior in others, especially the others that are part of my identity. This can take the form, as an example, of enabling someone who's got a destructive addiction and supporting them in that addiction instead of supporting them to get support and get help. It also can take the form of subordinating one's own needs in service of others. I say in service of others. Trying to help them, we actually subordinate our own needs. We become the martyr, in a sense, thinking that it's up to us to save them. In meditation practice, this diluted feminine energy can take the form of often confusion and doubt, of losing our belief in ourselves, and in ultimately giving up. There's an interesting contrast of stories that I want to share. And it's the stories of how myself and Emily handled the same basic phase of practice, the disillusionment phase, the first time that we really got into it. We were 5 years into our practice this time, really had done some retreat practice, had really gone deep in our daily practice, had been studying and working, and we found ourselves in this phase where everything was kind of dissolving and breaking apart. There was a lot of fear and anxiety and difficult emotions coming up. Everyone who goes deep in practice experiences some form of this at one time or another. And both of us were in it at the same time. And it was amazing to me how differently we responded to the situation. So my tendency, and what I did, was that I put on the gas even harder. I went from sitting for an hour a day to sitting for 2 hours a day. And I was determined to break through. And I was going to use every single moment of my day, if I could, to meditate and to note and to clearly see what was arising. And if I did that, then I would get through. But in fact, actually didn't. That didn't work for me. I stayed stuck, and I stayed in this sort of striving, grinding place. Emily, on the other hand, totally gave up formal practice. Where I went from an hour to 2 hours a day, she went from whatever she was doing a day to doing nothing. Instead, she would say that she was meditating when she was in the bath, and I'd always, give her hell for that and make fun of her, and she would make fun of me for my intense grinding away. And both of us actually stayed stuck. In both cases, we were exhibiting this diluted energetic manifestation, and in my case it was more of the diluted masculine. In her case it was more of the diluted feminine. She got confused, she wasn't sure what to do, and she just gave up and then justified that. In my case, I thought, if I double my efforts, then the more effort I put in, the more results I'll get, without really understanding that it wasn't just about the effort and the amount of time that I was practicing, but it was about my relationship to experience. So what does this feminine compassion look like when it becomes awakened? What does the masculine look like when it becomes awakened? I want to talk a bit about that. With the awake feminine compassion, the sense of self becomes fluid, and we can embrace others without abandoning ourselves, without abandoning our own needs and our own boundaries. This form of compassion involves an empathetic discernment, the ability to both feel and understand what's happening in another person's experience. The social psychologist Brené Brown shared at a talk I was at a few years ago a very interesting anecdote. She said that in her research, they were talking to people that were considered to be, among their communities, the most compassionate people around. These included people that were both in religious backgrounds, like monks and nuns, and they also included people that were leaders in their community and parents, etc. And these were the people they could find in their research that were the most compassionate based on what everyone said about them. And they wanted to see if there were any particular traits that were common among these different people from different backgrounds. And the one thing she said that they found among all of the different people who are considered the most compassionate people is that they all had immaculate boundaries. They all had this incredible ability to set and maintain limits and to really care for themselves even as they obviously were caring for others. This is really interesting. In action, this feminine compassion becomes whatever's needed and does whatever can be done to alleviate suffering. There is a deep sensitivity here to suffering and to its causes. And I think really what differentiates the feminine compassion from masculine compassion, this awakened form, is that there is in the feminine a radical embrace of the darkest, the ugliest, the shadowiest, the most confused and contorted aspects of reality, of humanity, of our being. The awakened feminine can understand and feel so deeply for that and for those things that can embrace with compassion everything, all of it, nothing left out. This is radical. In meditation practice, the form that this takes is often the breaking down of the separation between practice and life, between any sort of idea that what we do on the cushion or what we do in our formal practice lives is in any way not related to what's happening the rest of the time. That compartmentalization, that dichotomization breaks down in the awakened feminine. We sit to help others, we help others, and we use the practice to support that process. Every situation becomes an equal opportunity training ground for the awakened feminine. There's an emphasis here on the total acceptance of whatever is in experience when meditating. And there's also a deep and intuitive grasp of the distinction between what is my experience on the one hand and what are other people's experiences. There's a growing sense with the feminine compassion that we can really know each other's experiences and to be able to differentiate and distinguish between them so that we can respond more skillfully to what's there. Let's talk about the awakened masculine compassion. So the awakened masculine, the sense of self here, the sense of I or identity, is also fluid. It's not fixed. It includes oneself and it includes others. It includes the personal, particular nature of our reality, and it includes the universal dimension of human experience that we share in. And it does so without contradictions, without paradox. The awakened masculine can hold both knowing and not knowing together, can recognize when there is clear discernment, when there is clear seeing, and can maintain a confidence in that clarity and not be knocked off of one's center by other people's confusion. At the same time, this awakened masculine energy recognizes when it's deluding itself, recognizes the moment of delusion arising of starting to become righteous or starting to think that we do or can know everything, and can hold knowing loosely and lightly and be open and even playful in how one knows. In action, the masculine compassion takes the same basic form as feminine compassion. It becomes whatever is needed and does whatever can be done to alleviate suffering, but not in a way that destroys oneself or hurts oneself, unless that is actually what's called for. This awakened masculine displays vulnerability as strength. And the emphasis with the masculine side is on cutting through delusion, on slicing through confusion. This is from Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa. He said, true compassion is ruthless from ego's point of view because it does not consider ego's drive to maintain itself. True compassion is ruthless from ego's point of view, from the separate sense of I's point of view. But it's not actually ruthless from the point of view of awakened awareness. From that point of view, it is awake. It's the expression of awakening. Because this masculine compassion does a really good job of holding people in their biggest potential and not in their small stories. And it does that not because this potential is some latent thing that they could eventually grow into, but because it actually is their nature. It actually is our nature to be open-hearted and intelligent and brave. And of course, we do develop those capacities. But the masculine compassion sees clearly that that is in fact our nature, and it holds people to be what they are. It doesn't push them beyond what they're capable of. In fact, it invites them into something greater. In the context of meditation practice, this masculine compassion often takes the form of wise restraint, of not being a slave to one's impulses, to not being knocked off every time a craving arises or a desire comes or some sort of aversion comes to something. I don't like that. Instead of being knocked off by our impulses, the compassion that is masculine in its form can sit with and sit through those impulses. It's not a slave to them. It's bigger than our impulses. And it's bigger than other people's impulses. It doesn't try to make others feel comfortable for its own sake or because we always want people to be comfortable. It's actually willing to make others uncomfortable, to make ourselves uncomfortable in service of something deeper and more beautiful and more true. This masculine compassion in practice also has an unflinching, an unshakable quality to it, which bears witness to what is. There's a way in which it can hold everything and does hold everything. And now true compassion, this most genuine and awake quality of the heart, this quivering response to suffering. In actuality, it is neither feminine nor masculine. Yes, it takes whatever form is needed. And in the beginning, as we are developing and cultivating our practice, it takes whatever form we're naturally gifted in initially. Eventually, it opens us up to be able to take more forms and to be more fluid in our sense of who we are. We could say that when discernment is emphasized and held with empathy, that's a form or expression of masculine compassion. And when empathy is empathized, empathy is emphasized, and discernment is held in the background, then that's a form of feminine compassion. But both discernment and empathy have to be present and have to be operating. And what starts to happen is one deepens into the state of compassion, this quality of the compassionate heart, is that we oscillate back and forth between these different expressions, noticing the diluted expressions and waking up from them, learning how to move and express different ways of being that help the situation or help whatever is going on. We learn how to get better with that And over time, we start to see that whatever form we typically identify with and are attached to, that actually reality is calling for something so much bigger than that from us. If we really are showing up, really being present, really being willing to be vulnerable, then we do become whatever's needed.